The house is silent now. Too silent for a place where a life has just ended. Police lights cut across the walls in slow, rhythmic flashes, painting the room in red and blue. A man lies motionless on the floor. His body is cold. His eyes are open, fixed on nothing. Whatever happened here is already over. There is no struggle in sight. No shattered furniture. No broken windows. Just stillness. To the officers standing in this room, it looks like a tragic ending to an ordinary night. In the next room, a woman is sitting on the edge of a chair, folded into herself. Her hands tremble. Her breathing comes in short, uneven bursts. Tears streak down her face as she repeats the same sentence again and again. I don't understand. He was fine. He was just here. She is his wife. Right now, she is inconsolable. An officer gently offers her a glass of water. Another places a blanket around her shoulders. They speak to her softly, carefully, the way you speak to someone who has just lost everything. At this moment, no one is looking at her with suspicion. The first assumption comes easily. A sudden medical emergency. A tragic accident. A husband who never made it to the morning. It happens all the time. There are no visible signs of violence. No obvious weapon. No blood sprayed across the walls. The scene does not announce itself as a crime. One officer quietly radios in the preliminary assessment. Possible natural causes. The case, it seems, is already explaining itself. The wife cries into her hands. She tells them she tried to help him. She tells them she screamed for him to wake up. She tells them she called for help as fast as she could. Her voice cracks at the right moments. Her grief feels raw, uncontrolled, real. If anyone in that house believes she could be responsible for the man lying dead just a few feet away, they do not say it out loud. Because nothing here looks like murder. But death has a way of revealing what people try to hide. While paramedics confirm what everyone already knows, an investigator takes a slow look around the room. He notices what's missing as much as what's present. He makes mental notes. Small details. Easy to ignore details. A glance at a table. A look at the hallway. A pause longer than necessary. At this point, it still feels like a formality. No one is thinking about motive. Not yet. The wife is escorted out of the house as dawn approaches. Her sobs echo down the driveway as she's guided into the back of a patrol car, not under arrest, but for her own comfort. Neighbors watch in silence. To them, this is a terrible loss. A marriage cut short. A woman whose world has just collapsed. But in the days that follow, one question will begin to surface, quietly at first. A question that will turn sympathy into scrutiny. Because nothing about this scene would make sense once investigators followed the money. Before the flashing lights. Before the quiet house. Before one of them ended up on the floor. There was a marriage that, from the outside, looked complete. Two people who appeared to have built a life most would admire. The kind of life that feels stable, predictable, safe. The kind of life no one expects to end this way. Friends would later describe them with the same words, almost rehearsed. Happy. Solid. Always laughing. They were the couple who showed up together. The couple who remembered birthdays. The couple who never aired disagreements in public. At gatherings, they stood close. Not distant. Not cold. If there were cracks, no one could see them. On social media, the image was even clearer. Smiling photos. Vacations carefully framed. Anniversary posts filled with affectionate captions. Moments frozen in time, each one reinforcing the same idea. This was a marriage built on trust and partnership. Scrolling through their profiles, there was nothing alarming. No vague posts. No emotional outbursts. No hints of chaos behind the scenes. Just a curated life that looked balanced and successful. Financially, they appeared comfortable. Not extravagant, but secure. A nice home. Reliable cars. Occasional trips. The kind of lifestyle that suggests planning, discipline, and teamwork. Bills paid on time. Long-term goals discussed. A future that seemed mapped out. To friends and family, they were doing well. Better than most. The husband was often described as dependable, someone who worked hard and took pride in providing. He was steady, predictable in the best way. The wife, on the other hand, was described as warm, social, emotionally aware, the one who remembered details, the one who kept connections alive. Together, they seemed balanced, each filling the gaps the other left behind. But perfection has a way of discouraging questions. When a couple appears strong, people stop looking closer. They assume disagreements are normal, that stress comes and goes, that silence is just peace. So when small moments felt slightly off, they were dismissed just as quickly. A delayed reply, a forced smile, a conversation that ended too abruptly. Nothing that demanded attention. There were moments when the wife spoke for both of them, answering questions before he could, finishing his sentences, redirecting conversations away from certain topics. It didn't seem controlling. Not exactly. It seemed efficient, organized, helpful, and efficiency rarely raises alarms. There were also moments when the husband appeared tired, not exhausted in a dramatic way, just quiet, distracted, less present than he used to be. Friends noticed it, but they didn't press. Work stress, they assumed. Financial responsibility, the normal weight of adulthood. After all, everyone has phases. No one saw fear. No one heard threats. No one witnessed violence. What they saw was harmony, a marriage that looked stable enough to survive anything. And that illusion, the belief that everything was fine, would later become one of the most important reasons no one questioned what happened next. Because when tragedy struck, it didn't shatter a troubled relationship. It shattered a picture of perfection. To understand how everything unraveled, you have to understand the man at the center of it. The one who never saw it coming. He was not reckless. He was not careless. And he was not naive in the way people often imagine. He was dependable, consistent. The kind of person who believed that if you did the right things long enough, life would eventually meet you halfway. He came from a background shaped by routine and responsibility. Work was not optional, it was identity. Showing up mattered. Following through mattered. Those who knew him described him as someone who didn't complain, someone who carried pressure quietly, someone who believed stability was built, not wished for. He valued structure, and he trusted systems that appeared to work. Professionally, he was steady, not flashy, not impulsive. He believed in earning first, spending second. Paychecks went where they were supposed to go. Bills were handled. Savings were discussed. Financial security wasn't about status to him. It was about peace. The absence of worry. The comfort of knowing tomorrow was accounted for. He was generous by nature, not in grand gestures, but in quiet ways. Helping when asked. Offering support without keeping score. Believing that the people closest to him would do the same. He trusted easily, but not blindly. At least, that's what everyone believed. In the marriage, he was the anchor. He worked. He planned. He committed. And over time, he began to lean on his wife in ways that felt natural. She handled conversations. She handled details. She handled decisions that required social finesse. It didn't feel like dependence. It felt like partnership. When it came to finances, he trusted her judgment more than his own in certain areas. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he believed in division of roles. He focused on earning. She focused on managing. Accounts were shared. Decisions were discussed, then delegated. To him, this was efficiency. To outsiders, it looked like balance. But trust, when repeated without challenge, can slowly shift into surrender. He stopped asking detailed questions. He stopped double-checking statements. He stopped noticing small changes in spending. Not because he didn't care. Because he believed he didn't need to worry. Those closest to him would later say the same thing. He trusted her completely. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced. It happened quietly, over time, reinforced by years, without conflict. Trust became habit. And habit lowered defenses. What he didn't realize was that trust, once taken for granted, can become a weakness. Because when someone believes the person beside them would never harm them, they stop protecting themselves. They stop imagining betrayal, and they never see the danger standing closest of all. By the time his trust was tested, it was already too late. If the husband was the foundation of the marriage, the wife was its voice. She knew how to speak to people, how to listen just enough to make others feel understood, how to mirror emotions without revealing too much of her own. Those who met her often left with the same impression. She was composed. She was attentive. She was easy to trust. Her background did not suggest chaos or instability. She understood social dynamics early. She learned what people wanted to hear, and when they needed to hear it. She could shift tones effortlessly. Warm when warmth was expected. Serious when seriousness mattered. Vulnerable when vulnerability earned sympathy. This wasn't deception in the obvious sense. It was awareness. In group settings, she often guided the conversation, not dominating it, steering it. If a subject became uncomfortable, she redirected. If attention drifted, she pulled it back. She had a natural sense of timing, when to speak, when to stay quiet, and when to let silence do the work for her. People trusted her because she made them comfortable. And comfort lowers defenses. After the death, that same social intelligence went to work immediately. As neighbors gathered and friends reached out, she presented exactly what they expected to see. A woman in shock. A wife overwhelmed by loss. Someone struggling to process the unthinkable. Her grief was visible. Her voice unsteady. Her body language closed, protective. There was no performance that felt excessive. Nothing that felt forced. When police first spoke to her, she cooperated without hesitation. She answered questions calmly, though emotionally. She didn't rush. She didn't resist. She filled silences with detail, just enough detail. She spoke about routine. She spoke about concern. She spoke about confusion. She framed the night as ordinary until it suddenly wasn't. Her statements followed a careful pattern. She described events in broad strokes, avoiding specifics that could later be challenged. When she wasn't certain, she said so. When memory failed, she admitted it. This didn't raise alarms. It made her appear honest. Officers noted her emotional responses. Tears came at the right moments. Her voice tightened when she spoke about finding him. She expressed guilt, wondering if she could have done more. Guilt, after all, is common in sudden loss. And common reactions rarely invite scrutiny. She never accused anyone. She never suggested foul play. She never tried to shape the investigation directly. She let assumptions form on their own. That restraint mattered. Because people tend to trust those who don't appear to be pushing an agenda. At this stage, she was not a suspect. She was a widow. A grieving partner left behind with questions and pain. Someone the investigation revolved around, but did not focus on. And it worked. Because investigators would later realize that almost every word she spoke was carefully chosen. The night began like countless others. No arguments reported. No raised voices heard by neighbors. No urgent messages sent to friends or family. According to the account given, it was ordinary, quiet, uneventful. The kind of night that doesn't leave a mark until it does. She told investigators they spent the evening at home. Simple routines, familiar movements, nothing out of the ordinary. They ate. They talked. They settled into their separate habits within the same space. At some point, she said, he complained of not feeling well. Not alarmingly so. Just enough to be mentioned. She described checking on him periodically. He waved her off. Said he was fine. Said he just needed rest. This detail mattered. Because it placed responsibility back into his hands. It suggested independence. Choice. And choice removes suspicion. According to her, the next time she saw him, something was wrong. She said she found him unresponsive, not breathing normally, not reacting when she called his name. Panic set in. At least, that's how she described it. The emergency call lasted several minutes. Her voice was strained, uneven. She struggled to answer questions while following instructions. She told the dispatcher she didn't know what had happened. She said she had just found him like this. There was urgency, but also hesitation. Pauses where there shouldn't have been pauses. First responders arrived quickly. They assessed the scene, checked for signs of life, attempted resuscitation. Nothing worked. The man was already gone. Time of death would later become a point of quiet debate, because not everything aligned. Investigators began their routine documentation. They photographed the room, the furniture, the position of the body, the absence of disorder. They noted what was there and what wasn't. No clear weapon, no overturned objects, no visible signs of forced entry. At first glance, the scene explained itself, but closer inspection introduced questions. Minor marks on the body that didn't immediately fit a natural collapse. Small details that were easy to overlook, but hard to dismiss once noticed. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough to be recorded. The timeline became less certain as investigators compared notes. Her account placed events within a narrow window, but physical indicators suggested something slightly different. Not hours apart, minutes. But minutes matter, especially when reconstructing a final moment. The emergency call, when reviewed later, revealed subtle inconsistencies. Her descriptions shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed when replayed side by side. Small changes in wording, minor adjustments in sequence, clarifications that came only after prompting, each one easy to explain, individually harmless. Investigators noted the way she described discovering him, where she was standing, what she touched, what she did first. The details didn't always line up the same way twice. Grief can distort memory. Everyone knows that. So the questions remained internal. For now, as the night turned into morning, the house was cleared. Evidence logged. Reports filed. Assumptions carried forward. The working conclusion remained unchanged. A tragic death. A devastated spouse. No immediate sign of a crime. But as investigators prepared to move on, one detail lingered. A detail that didn't fit the rest of the picture. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It didn't demand attention at first. But once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Because the story she told would soon collapse under one undeniable detail. The detail that refused to fade had nothing to do with the body. It wasn't a mark. It wasn't a measurement. It wasn't even something found inside the house. It was paperwork. Because when a death appears uncomplicated, investigators begin looking at what survives the person who died. And money always survives. Routine procedure turned into focused review. Bank statements, insurance records, account histories. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Shared accounts, regular deposits, normal spending patterns, the kind of financial footprint thousands of couples leave behind. But then, the timeline tightened, and the patterns changed. Life insurance policies became the first point of interest, not because they existed, but because of when they were adjusted. Coverage had increased. Beneficiaries were clear. Paperwork was recent. Too recent to ignore. The husband had not mentioned any major change in planning. No illness. No warning. No reason to revisit coverage at that moment in time. Yet the documents were signed, filed, approved, active. Investigators asked a simple question. Who initiated the changes? The answer led back to the same person every time. The wife. She had handled the paperwork, made the calls, scheduled the meetings, presented the documents as routine updates. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious on its face. Just initiative. Then came the accounts no one had mentioned. Separate banking activity that didn't align with shared finances. Transfers that moved quietly, incrementally, over time. Not large enough to raise alarms. Not frequent enough to draw attention. But consistent and deliberate. Some funds went toward expenses the husband had never discussed. Luxury items purchased discreetly. payments that suggested a lifestyle more ambitious than what friends believed they lived. It wasn't reckless spending. It was controlled, measured, as if someone was careful not to be noticed. Debt began to surface as well. Not catastrophic, not overwhelming, but present. Credit lines opened. Balances carried longer than necessary. Financial obligations that didn't align with the image of stability. The kind of pressure that doesn't explode all at once. The kind that builds quietly. Investigators searched for documentation the husband might have seen. There was little. Many communications went directly to the wife. Many statements were digital. Many approvals were handled without his direct involvement. Because he trusted her to manage it. Because she had always done so. The pattern became harder to dismiss. Increased coverage. Hidden movement of funds. Growing financial strain masked by normalcy. None of it proved wrongdoing. But together, it suggested motive. And motive changes everything. Psychologically, the picture shifted. Greed doesn't arrive fully formed. It escalates. It begins as justification, as entitlement, as quiet resentment. A belief that one deserves more. A belief that sacrifice has already been made. And once that belief takes root, morality becomes flexible. Investigators considered the unthinkable. What if the money wasn't just a benefit? What if it was the plan? What if the death solved problems that were becoming harder to control? Questions that would have sounded outrageous just days earlier now felt necessary. Nothing had been proven. No accusation had been made. But the direction of the investigation had changed. Because when the numbers were laid out in front of them, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a tragedy. It was a transaction waiting to be exposed. The investigation was no longer routine. At first, it had been the sort of case where officers filed the reports, spoke with neighbors, and waited for results. But as evidence accumulated, the veneer of simplicity began to peel away. Small contradictions emerged, almost imperceptible at first. Words that didn't match previous statements. Timelines that didn't align. Moments that didn't add up. The wife had described finding him exactly where she said. Yet forensic analysis suggested he had been moved, or that his final moments did not correspond with her version of events. The marks on his body, once dismissed as minor, now told a story of a struggle or manipulation no one had anticipated. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just subtle, enough to warrant closer attention. Witnesses who had spoken to the couple in the days leading up to the incident recalled details that conflicted with the official account. A neighbor had seen them arguing quietly in the kitchen, though the wife claimed their evening had been peaceful. A friend received a text that hinted at tension she hadn't mentioned to investigators. Nothing conclusive, nothing prosecutable. But patterns were beginning to emerge. Digital evidence began to paint an even more complicated picture. Text messages the husband sent that were never responded to. Calls that were missed, ignored, or redirected. Online searches that suggested curiosity or preparation. About matters no one had yet connected to the night in question. Each file, each message, each call became a clue, a thread to follow. Security footage added another layer of intrigue. From the street, from nearby stores, from the couple's own neighborhood cameras. Movements were logged. Timelines could be reconstructed. Small discrepancies emerged. She claimed to have been in one room, but cameras placed her elsewhere. Not enough to prove guilt, but enough to raise questions. Investigators now began to examine statements in sequence, comparing one to another. Every time she recounted the story, slight adjustments appeared. Minor shifts in phrasing. Subtle changes in timing. Each one was explainable. Human memory is fallible. Grief is messy. But together, the inconsistencies formed a pattern, like a puzzle missing a few critical pieces. The forensic team continued their work. Subtle bruising, tiny abrasions, evidence of handling or movement, items out of place. It wasn't enough to make a conclusion, but it was enough to make suspicion unavoidable. When combined with digital records, witness statements, and the emerging financial picture, it suggested the story being told was incomplete. Investigators began revealing discrepancies to one another carefully. Not all at once. Not publicly. Not in a way that could tip off the subject. One lie revealed here. One omission exposed there. Each revelation was incremental, but cumulative. Slowly, a picture was forming behind the scenes, a picture that didn't match the narrative presented to authorities. Even small details mattered. The time she claimed to call for help. The exact words she used on the emergency line. The path she said she took to check on him. Each point, when cross-checked against evidence, created tension. The investigators felt it. The team knew something was being hidden, but exactly what and why remained unclear. Every layer removed seemed to uncover another. The more they examined, the more subtle contradictions appeared. The story that had seemed flawless just weeks ago began to feel fragile. And yet, at this point, no one could say for certain who, if anyone, was responsible. Every inconsistency built suspense. Every overlooked detail became significant. Investigators proceeded methodically, like detectives following invisible threads. Because one thing was already clear, the facade was cracking. And eventually, each carefully chosen word she had spoken would have to be reconciled with the truth. Weeks of investigation led to one inevitable step, a formal interrogation. The atmosphere in the small, sterile room was tense but controlled. 2 detectives. Paperwork stacked neatly in front of them. Recording devices humming quietly. And across from them sat the woman who, until now, had appeared flawless, grieving, composed, untouchable. At first, she remained calm, collected, cooperative, answers precise, language carefully measured. Her tone, once consistently steady, began to shift as questioning probed areas she had not prepared for. Her eyes darted slightly, hands folded tighter. Pauses between sentences became longer. The detectives observed her behavior closely, noting microexpressions, small twitches, subtle tension. Behavioral analysis isn't guesswork, it's careful observation. And what they were seeing didn't match the story she had told publicly. Detectives asked about the timeline of the night, about the calls, about where she had been when she found him, about financial documents the husband may have never seen. At first, she answered with the same statements she had rehearsed countless times. But as details were pressed, dates, times, inconsistencies, the story began to fragment. Tone shifted. Hesitation crept in. Suddenly, the woman who had appeared so controlled was suddenly human, vulnerable, defensive. She tried subtle redirects. Blame was gently shifted. Perhaps someone else had made a deposit. Perhaps the timeline was wrong. Perhaps the evidence was misread. At times, she even questioned herself out loud, as though unsure what was real and what wasn't, another tactic to sow doubt. Detectives remained silent, patient, waiting for the cracks to widen. Psychologists later reviewed the footage. They noted patterns common in high-stakes deception. Repetition of phrases over justification, feigned uncertainty, microaggressions toward authority figures. Every shift in tone, every hesitation, every defensive gesture was catalogued. And slowly, the controlled facade she had perfected began to crumble. The turning point came in a simple question. A detail about a transaction. A phrase she had used incorrectly in previous statements. Something small, easily overlooked. She paused. Her hands fidgeted. Eyes flickered away from the table. Then, almost imperceptibly, she revealed the first true inconsistency. An admission she hadn't intended to make. The detectives leaned in quietly. No raised voices. No accusations. Just patience and precision. Every attempt she made to redirect blame failed. Every justification she offered only drew more attention to the inconsistencies. The web she had carefully spun in words and behavior was unraveling thread by thread. By the end of the session, one thing was undeniable. She understood the game had changed. Confidence had been replaced by calculation. Control had been replaced by panic. And in that moment, She made the first mistake that would eventually seal her fate. Because even the most carefully chosen lies can crumble when someone knows exactly what to look for. Days after the interrogation, the arrest was made. Officers arrived quietly at her home in the early morning hours. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, their whispers filling the street. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming, no chaotic scene. She was escorted out in handcuffs, calm on the surface, but the detectives would later describe a subtle tension in her gait, tight shoulders, a face attempting neutrality. The charges were clear: premeditated murder motivated by financial gain. Media coverage immediately followed, painting her as the seemingly perfect wife who had hidden something deadly behind charm and grief. Cameras captured the contrast: the public widow versus the accused killer. Inside, investigators felt a sense of closure, but the case was far from over. Courtroom proceedings began weeks later. The prosecution presented a meticulously structured case. Timelines reconstructed from digital evidence and surveillance footage. Financial records showing life insurance changes and secret accounts. Witness statements highlighting inconsistencies in her story. Expert testimony analyzing her behavior during interrogation. Every piece was designed to illustrate motive, premeditation, and deception. The defense argued tirelessly. They claimed grief could explain every hesitation. Memory lapses were natural. Financial decisions were standard in a household. They painted her as a devoted wife, overwhelmed by tragedy, with inconsistencies arising only from human error, not intent. The courtroom watched. The jury listened. Every word, every gesture weighed heavily. As testimony progressed, subtle shifts in demeanor emerged. The wife remained composed publicly, but occasionally faltered when pressed on the smallest detail. Prosecutors highlighted these moments subtly, letting them linger in the jury's perception. Psychologists later noted that microexpressions and tone often conveyed more than spoken words, and jurors responded to these cues in ways the defense could not counter. The jury deliberated for days, each member weighing motive, behavior, and circumstantial evidence. Arguments for doubt were balanced against the consistency of evidence, pointing to premeditation. In the end, patterns of deception, financial manipulation, and contradictory statements outweighed the defense's portrayal of grief and confusion. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty. The room held its breath. She remained silent, expression neutral, as the sentence was announced. Life imprisonment without parole. Family members of the victim wept. Investigators allowed themselves a quiet moment of relief. Justice, in this case, had been served, but the weight of betrayal lingered. The courtroom emptied slowly. Cameras faded from the scene. Outside, the world tried to reconcile the image of the grieving wife with the verdict that declared her guilty. A life once considered perfect had been torn apart, piece by decisions that were hidden in plain sight. And for those who had watched from the very beginning, the story still carried a chilling lesson. Appearances can be deceiving, and trust can be the deadliest vulnerability. The verdict did not end the story. For the family, grief continued to weigh heavily. Parents, siblings, and close friends were left to navigate a world that had been violently upended, not just by death, but by betrayal. They spoke quietly in interviews, struggling to reconcile the husband they knew with the woman they had trusted. Words stumbled, emotions ran raw. Love, shock, and disbelief intertwined. The public response was intense. Social media threads exploded with speculation. News outlets ran continuous updates, replaying moments from the trial, highlighting evidence, and dissecting every detail of her life. She had become a symbol of calculated deception, a warning story repeated across screens, feeds, and headlines. People debated motives, financial pressures, and whether warning signs had been ignored. Everyone had an opinion, some sympathetic, some unforgiving, but all were captivated. Media coverage focused on contrasts. Images of the happy, smiling wife in vacation photos juxtaposed against courtroom footage. Headlines emphasized betrayal, greed, and manipulation. Financial documents were scrutinized. Life insurance payouts, hidden accounts, and lifestyle expenses became central narratives. Through it all, the public was forced to reconcile the picture-perfect marriage they had admired with the darkness that had existed in private. Financially, the outcome was telling. The husband's estate, including life insurance and other assets, became frozen during investigation. The wife could no longer access accounts. Investments she had maneuvered were now under the jurisdiction of the court. Any benefit she had anticipated from his death was completely eliminated by the conviction, while the family was left to manage the estate and recover what they could. In the end, the only ones who truly benefited from the tragedy were the investigators who uncovered the truth and the justice system that ensured accountability. The husband's life, his work, and his trust had been lost forever. The world had watched a marriage unravel, a life stolen, and a betrayal exposed, reminding everyone that the most devastating acts often hide behind familiarity, love, and trust. It's easy, in hindsight, to point to a single moment and call it the turning point. But real life rarely unfolds in neat, decisive points. The story of this marriage and its tragic end was built over years of trust, carefully hidden ambition, and decisions that at first seemed harmless. Moments that appeared ordinary, delegating finances, adjusting policies, minor omissions in conversation, accumulated quietly until they created a space where deception could thrive. For viewers, there are lessons to consider, not moralizing but cautionary. Trust is essential in relationships, but unquestioned trust can become a vulnerability. Financial secrecy or sudden changes, however subtle, can sometimes indicate something more than simple oversight. And the people who seem most charming, most composed, and most socially intelligent are not always who they appear to be, especially when their actions are guided by self-interest. Money, when intertwined with ambition and desire, can corrode empathy. It can warp priorities. It can justify betrayal. It can turn love into strategy and partnership into exploitation. This case reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger is invisible, hidden behind the facade of normalcy. And as we reflect on the lives affected, the husband lost, the family devastated, the trust shattered, the final, chilling reality becomes clear. In the end, she didn't just murder her husband. She destroyed every life that trusted her. If you want more cases where greed turned deadly, subscribe to this channel. Like, share, and turn on the notification bell.